Hi everyone, my name's Helen and I work in the public sector team here in the Carbon Trust. Welcome to today's webinar looking at local energy generation and heat networks. In this webinar, we'd like to introduce you to some of the key issues in identifying opportunities for local energy generation and networks. And this is an area where we've been seeing a particularly high level of interest at the moment. I'll just hand over to Ben now, who's going to go into the first slide.
Yes, good morning. My name's Ben, and I'm the Technical Support Manager to the Public Sector, and I work with Helen supporting the public sector on a range of decentralised energy projects, from sort of PV systems right through to district heating networks. So, first of all, I suppose we should define what we mean by decentralised energy, and this is a term that we tend to use, and the definition of that is sort of varied, but we essentially, when we talk about decentralised energy, we're talking about off-grid solutions, and those technologies that we include within decentralised energy can range from things like energy from waste, ground source heat pumps, solar thermal heating, and also solar PV, wind, and also energy networks. Now, this particular picture here is an example of an energy network, a heat network, in Denmark, and this is really where the interest in the UK in networks has come from, and a lot of the presentation today will refer to networks and the development of networks from local authorities. So why has decentralised energy become more interesting? Well, national demand for electricity is predicted to rise, and this is driven really by the needs of utility companies to meet demands from businesses and also domestic customers. As well as that, of course, reserves of fossil fuels are finite and will deplete, and there's an urgent need now to find new forms of energy generation to plug the projected gap, or the energy generation gap, that will be created as coal and oil plants or central plants come off the system to meet European emissions targets. So it's essential really for the UK to start generating more energy locally and using energy more efficiently. And this is demonstrated by this graphic, where you can see for a typical centralised power plant that over 60% of the energy units that enter the power plant in the form of fossil fuels are lost in the form of heat. So when we talk about networks, quite often we're talking about local power generation and usage of heat, through these networks.
Okay, so why is this a strategic priority for local authorities when the public sector is under a huge amount of resource pressure? There needs to be a very good reason for them to take on anything new and anything that's not a statutory obligation. And one of the reasons we're seeing for the current high level of interest is that the decentralised energy can be part of the solution to a number of social and financial challenges that local authorities face. Now, the list on this slide isn't an exhaustive list, but these are the issues that we're seeing most often driving local authorities to take this on as a strategic priority. Firstly, they can use these projects to create a new source of revenue. So if a council invests in a project through either own capital budgets or through cheap public sector borrowing, then they can use the income from heat and electricity sales as a new and stable source of revenue. Cutting energy costs is another big issue, and if structured correctly, which includes getting the business model right, decentralised energy can cut costs for buildings that are connected and supplied. It can help tackle fuel poverty. Decentralized energy technologies can reduce the heat costs for those in fuel poverty. For example, you can connect a social housing block to a district heating scheme, as has been done in places like Islington recently. Again, the business model is critical there because the heat price needs to be kept low, which will obviously have an impact on a private supplier's profits. It can help improve energy security. So installing either off-grid renewables or even a grid-connected gas-fired CHP that means less fuel is needed to meet the same demand can allow local authorities to reduce the threat of constrained capacity at power stations and interruptions to supply, and can even protect against extreme weather events, as was shown after Superstorm Sandy in the US, when there were areas of Manhattan served by CHP networks and they continued to have access to power generated via the CHP, where everywhere around them was cut off and in darkness. It can help cut carbon, but also to cut carbon tax costs. So even a lower carbon gas-fired CHP district heating network is more efficient than individual boilers because it generates both heat and electricity from the fuel that's being burnt. And renewable schemes have even greater benefits for carbon reduction, as well as benefiting from incentives like ROC's renewable obligation certificates or the RHI, the renewable heat incentive, or FITs. And finally, it can actually be very useful in attracting development, regeneration. If you have either a network that developers can easily, affordably connect to, that can enable them to meet planning requirements very cheaply and easily, which can be attractive to them. And local authorities can also help developers by identifying where particular technologies will or won't work and having that in their planning evidence base, so the developer doesn't have to do that work themselves. They can see what they can most effectively use where and what the local authority wants them to use. So why does the public sector have a strategic role in these projects? One reason is the ownership of key buildings. So local authorities will own a number of buildings, universities own university buildings, libraries, halls of residence, all sorts of buildings, research labs, and there are hospitals, and these buildings have very, very significant energy and heat demand, so they are big users and they can form the core of a network. One reason why they're attractive, other than their sheer level of demand, is that heat network investments need certainty over the demand for heat in connected buildings, and it is much easier for publicly owned buildings to predict future use and to commit to long-term contracts for heat and power supply that make the project a viable investment. It's much harder for private buildings to sign up to those long-term contracts. The ability to invest and increase project viability is very important. So private investors will come to these projects with a cost of capital, with requirements for profit generation, with internal rate of return hurdle rates that could potentially make a project unviable for them, or more likely it could compromise the achievement of strategic objectives. Whereas a local authority or another public body could invest with a lower cost of borrowing or no cost of capital and make those objectives more achievable and the project more viable. Public bodies also have the ability to influence the project development to make sure that strategic objectives, like the ones we've just been talking about, are actually achieved in the delivery of the project. So whereas a commercial provider is obviously driven by profit, that might be problematic where you have an objective such as supplying very cheap heat to vulnerable residents in order to address fuel poverty. You need to understand the project well enough to establish what is and isn't possible, both technically and financially, in order to be able to specify effectively when you're using private suppliers and to negotiate on equal terms with them. And that's not a criticism of those providers and suppliers, but it's just the reality of dealing with a profit-driven organisation who you might well find yourself asking to do something like offer a lower heat price, which is going to eat into their profit margin. And then finally, planning powers to encourage and support or discourage decentralized energy technologies. You can do things like identifying key sites, safeguarding future pipe routes for heat networks. The decentralized energy market in the UK is still relatively new, and local authorities can do a huge amount to facilitate its development through a positive, proactive and supportive planning framework. So just to look at some examples now. So there are a number of other external factors other than those strategic objectives that are driving more and more organisations to look at these schemes. So we've got DEC prioritising heat networks and hopefully some support coming from them soon. There are high-profile new schemes being developed in places like London and Birmingham and Leicester, and there are incentives coming online like the non-domestic renewable heat incentive, and there's publicity from organisations like the Carbon Trust and others just raising awareness of the opportunity and doing some outreach there. And as we're seeing more and more awareness and examples coming forward, local authorities in particular are becoming more confident and empowered about their own potential role in developing projects. So, for example, Bun Hill in Islington is a fully public model that's now completed and operational, and is providing cheaper, greener heat to homes in the Bun Hill area. Gateshead up in the northeast have also taken the public route and have now procured a design and the public consultation phase. One advantage particularly that these public schemes have is that local authorities are very well placed to become local energy suppliers because of high levels of trust that they enjoy from local residents, in contrast to the general level of trust that the public has in the traditional energy companies. And we're working with quite a few people, including Bristol and Crawley. They're leading the development of the heat networks in their areas and looking at the role that they can play and how they can make sure those projects fulfill their objectives. One reason for this increased interest in the public model for delivering these networks is this realization that private sector models need to make a profit. They need to put a commercial price on risk. You can't expect them to take risk on and not to have to pay for it. And local authorities particularly looking more and more carefully about whether those are costs that they really want to bear and whether they want to retain more of the benefits from the projects like revenue within the local authority. Of course, in some cases, a fully private model will still be the right solution for that area, for example, where a local authority isn't primarily motivated by generating revenue for the council or maximising the savings, or where they have absolutely no access to either public borrowing or capital of any form. So, for example, Leicester recently procured a fully private scheme that was helped with the now closed community energy savings programme, and that was the right model they decided for them. The most important thing to remember with the private model is to inform yourselves as well as possible so that you can engage effectively with the market and get the best of what's on offer and then negotiate with them on equal terms. And finally, just one thing that seems to be in common across all the different business models from fully public to fully private is that it's driven by a local energy agenda. So local authorities in particular are wanting to take more control of their own energy generation for their own buildings and also for their own local areas. Looking at things like energy security, they see the risks of inadequate or vulnerable centralised energy infrastructure, whether that's because it's constraining growth because there's limited capacity, or if it's the social and economic consequences of disruptions to centralised supply. And these decentralised energy projects have the potential to solve those problems for them.
Okay, thank you, Helen. So, how can local authorities identify opportunities? Well, there's a huge range of methods of identifying opportunities. Just some of them are listed here, and we've tried to put them in a sort of logical order for how you would approach these, so that if you've visited any of them already, then you can move on to the next step. So the first opportunity would be through the National Heat Map. So the National Heat Map is available on the DEC website, and it shows GIS layers of demand and heat sources across local authority boundaries. So that's a good place to start to see across your local authority where there's sites where there's heat demand and where there's potential sources of heat. So CHPs that are already installed, thermal power stations that are in the area, and you can start to look at the distances between heat sources and heat demands within the locality. The next step is somewhat open to debate in how you should approach this, because it may well involve some investment. So should you look at high-level feasibility first, once you've identified potential areas for networks, or should you look at carrying out more detailed energy master planning, more local heat mapping, and looking more into the character areas and demand? So when I talk about character areas, we're talking in terms of energy, so the density of energy, the likely ground conditions, the space available, the planning constraints, the opportunity to have energy centres locally and the constraints on that, the existing subterranean systems that are in place, and how complex and busy that is underground. So taking all of those things into account, you can start to look at the potential for different technologies. So it's likely within energy dense areas where there's high heat demands, such as city centres and town centres. There's likely to be the best potential for the technologies there is likely to be in the form of heat networks, whereas as you move out to less energy dense areas, the opportunities are more going to be around micro renewables and individual buildings, and doing that, going through that process, possibly working with some external support, gives you an informed evidence base for planning, and that feeds into your energy master planning process. In terms of high-level feasibility, we can start to look at the distance between demands and any potential sort of barriers that are in place. So, for example, if you identify a high heat demand next to a significant heat source, or an area of high heat demand which could be served by an energy centre, then you can start to look at some of the barriers and constraints for that network. So, for example, is there a railway line or a motorway or major road network going through that area, and what are the likely impacts of that on the cost of running pipes over that area? So we would always advise that when you start to look at that stage, if you don't have the in-house skills and knowledge in that area, it's worth engaging with an organisation like the Carbon Trust, who can help you to start thinking through those issues at that stage. And also then we can help you with briefs and with engagement with technical consultants in making sure that you get value for money in the development of the scheme, in terms of the techno-economic model that's taken forward. Another big opportunity to identify potential networks is through planning. So working closely with the planning department, if that's not where you're working at the moment, you can talk with them about new developments that are coming online, and also make them aware of things like the National Heat Map, any energy master planning that's been done, and that should inform the planning process and getting planners to think about energy infrastructure as part of the planning process. So if there's new developments coming online with high potential heat demand, could they be located next to an existing thermal power plant where you could potentially take heat from that? And how should the planning department be working with developers to make sure that they can meet planning policy at the lowest possible cost? So again, looking at things and taking the role of facilitation and working with potential suppliers of heat. That's a role that really only the local authority can take in getting that heat to the places of demand and into new developments. There's also likely to be a significant amount of existing feasibility studies, and this could be within the local authority itself, or it could be externally, particularly with public sector partners such as universities and the NHS, who may have already started to look at their own networks. Now, it's one of the key roles of a local authority is thinking about how these public sector loads might be brought together in creating larger networks that can run more efficiently, and then can also serve, as Helen mentioned, some of the sort of social objectives of the local authority in using those loads to connect to areas where there's potential fuel poverty, and giving them subsidised low-cost heat and power potentially to those areas. Also, the local authority also has a key role in that really within any given area it's the only or one of the few organisations that can convene and facilitate and talk to public sector partners about starting up networks, and also obviously with planning powers as well. There's a key role there for the authority. So when we talk about projects and investing in projects, we really need to bring together three aspects: legal, financial and technical. And in bringing these three together and thinking about them together and going through an iterative process of thinking of all of those aspects in relation to a potential project, that's when you get an investable project with reduced risk. So in terms of those three areas, in terms of the technical area, you could be thinking about the generation technology that's chosen, the network route and length, the engine size and the configuration of that engine, if an engine is required, or if a heat source is required, the willingness of the provider of that heat to sell heat into a network, the buildings that are going to be connected and which are economically viable to connect, phasing of the work programme and whether you start with small clusters and then develop into a larger network, and then the operation, maintenance and detailed design work. So obviously each of those elements within the technical project has a financial aspect, and as you change those technical aspects, there's an impact on the financial side. So the financial side, when we're looking at techno-economic models, we're looking at the potential, the IRR of the scheme and the NPV of the scheme, and the interest of external investors in investing in that project, and whether the local authority is willing to invest in it themselves. Also, you have to look at the potential for heat sales, and if one of your objectives is alleviating fuel poverty, then you have to work out methods of reducing the cost of heat and power to areas of fuel poverty, and how that's going to be included within the overall scheme. Obviously, as well as part of that, as part of the investment and the finance, you have to give consideration to debt or equity, risk and rewards, and investment by the local authority. And all of these things feed into the legal aspect, which is commitment from customers in the terms of heat contracts, the governance structures and role of private sector partners, community ownership if that's possible, and that can help to get the community on board in terms of these projects, whether there's a cooperative, and the ownership that the local authority will have in that and the influence it will have within that. Obviously, the higher the ownership percentage, the bigger the influence, but the bigger the risk that the local authority takes. but also the bigger the potential reward and the more that they can shape that project. So again, it's a complex dynamic between these three aspects, and getting that right can be a sort of long and difficult process, and that's why we always think that it's useful to have an organisation such as the Carbon Trust involved in these projects to help guide you through those stages and help you to understand each of those stages, and also to help communicate the outputs of any work that's done to internal and external stakeholders. So despite all of that and the complexities within that dynamic of a project, we tend to find that the biggest issue and the biggest barrier in getting projects to market is actually an institutional one. So a lot of the work that the Carbon Trust do is working closely with local authorities and public sector partners to help them to understand projects, develop in-house capacity, and get senior management commitment and support to a project. And there's various different ways in which you can do that, and articulate the case and get buy-in from organisations, and that's something that we have a great deal of experience of from the projects that Helen mentioned and others outside of that. So the local authority has a key role in many stages within a given project, and often this depends upon the nature of the project. So it could be a developer comes to you with a potential project that's supported by an energy supplier, and obviously the local authority then has to take a view as to whether that's something they're interested in being involved in, and the strategic aspect of having energy assets owned within a local area by a local supplier, and which organisations might be supplied by that local supplier and the contracts they're tied into, and also how that impacts upon the ambitions of the local authority more broadly, and whether there is an interest in owning energy infrastructure and having a say in how that's developed across the local area. In terms of opportunity identification, obviously we've talked about heat maps, energy master planning, working with the planning department and how you can identify opportunities through that, and then obviously how you can communicate that to external stakeholders, whether that's highlighting an opportunity to work where the local authority works with a supplier, or something where the local authority takes that forward themselves and looks to convene and facilitate and develop the network through investment by the local authority itself or the public sector partners involved in the scheme. So, as well as that, of course, there's the financial viability of scheme, and in investing in the scheme, the local authority provides certainty to potential customers that may wish to connect. It's also able to secure more or cheaper finance than the private sector would be, and it's also willing to take, as Helen mentioned, willing to take less of a potential return on investment than the private sector does, and deal with more of the sort of social and economic growth issues within the area that these networks can support. So we've been through a sort of a brief run through of the potential for networks and the role that a local authority has within those, and also more broadly the way the local authority can work with public sector partners and developers. But if you do want more information on this, and you would like to get some more information on the projects that the Carbon Trust have been involved in, the projects that we're currently involved in, and our methodology for getting decentralised energy projects to market, whether it be networks or photovoltaics or wind, then please feel free to contact either Helen or myself on the following contact details, whether that's via email or phone. We'd be happy to talk with you and take your questions and give you guidance as is appropriate. So thanks very much for dialing in, and will be in touch soon, hopefully. Thank you. Bye.